First of all, the word globalization appears on the front of your book. It's a pretty imprecise term for a lot of people. So what do you mean by it?
So to me, the key aspect of globalization is when people in one part of the world are affected by demand for goods in another part of the world over which they have no control. And we can see that happening most clearly in the year 1000. The place where globalization is most advanced at that point is in Asia, and where there is extensive trade between China and Southeast Asia, and then on to the Islamic world.
Well, we'll come on to that in a little moment. But first of all, Gideon Rackerman, let's talk about what's happening right now. Do you think that the virus itself, is that a real threat to what we call globalization?
I think it is a threat. I mean, as you said in your introduction, it's not going to be a totally dramatic transition in which the whole system that we've got used to collapses or turns into something completely new. But I think that it's made people much more aware of the risks and fragilities in this hyper-globalized world that we've begun living in over the last 40 years, and in particular, obviously, pandemics, and the willingness, perhaps the necessity to shut borders very dramatically is taking us back to an era that we thought long gone, where you can't fly to another country.
And I mentioned Christopher Columbus and Vasco da Gama earlier on. From your point of view, what's the overlap between what we call globalization and rule by the West?
Well, I think that for maybe 500 years since the Vasco da Gama era, you could make a powerful case that globalization was essentially synonymous with Western dominance, because the Europeans were so far advanced of the societies that they were encountering technologically and in terms of armaments that essentially it led to imperialism. And then even in the modern era of globalization, which I would date from the late 1970s, when China begins to open up, that was also for a long period seemed to be synonymous with Americanization. It was just countries such as China in particular, but also India and others, trying to, as it seemed, just catch up with the West. And it didn't appear, at least initially, to threaten global power structures. The United States, particularly after the end of the Cold War, was the dominant global power. I think that's what's begun to change in the last 10 years and really meant that there was already a backlash against globalization growing even before this pandemic, is that there's been a dawning realization in the West that actually globalization and Westernization and American dominance are no longer synonymous, that China has caught up with the West in many respects. In some respects, technologically, it's even surpassed the US in certain areas. And I think when the Chinese announced a program, what they call Made in China 2025, and said that they plan to become the world's leading power in a range of technologies from artificial intelligence to semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, I think the American establishment, maybe the Western establishment, really took fright. And that was a big part of the background to the backlash against globalization, the sense that it was no longer really a process that the West controlled and benefited from.
Valerie, let's reverse 1,000 years, back to the year 1000 or thereabouts, and you start your book with the Vikings, whose exploring was extraordinary. They go from the Scandinavia to Iceland, Iceland to Greenland, and then from Greenland to North America. But as globalizers, potentially, Valerie, they weren't that impressive. They didn't really change very much in North America when they arrived.
That's true. The Vikings who go to what's now Newfoundland in Canada don't stay long. We think about 10 years. And after they leave, the main thing that they're importing from North America is lumber and some fur. But they're very influential in the opposite direction when they go into Eastern Europe and mix with the local peoples and create this
Russia.
new... They create, right, the ancestor of modern Russia and also modern Ukraine.